The 90s were an amazing time for movie soundtracks if you were a heavy metal or hard rock fan. It seemed like once or twice a year a new movie was being released that had a soundtrack with some of the best bands of the time. How would you like Megadeth, Anthrax, Alice in Chains, and AC/DC all on the same album? Or what about Pantera, Sepultura, Machine Head, and Megadeth? Well, in the 90s we got both, and then some. Hey everyone, this is Kennedy from None More Metal, and today I'm talking about soundtracks that feature heavy metal and hard rock bands. Specifically movie soundtracks from the 1990s, which turned out to be the golden age if you're a fan of these bands. What's funny is that a lot of the movies that feature these soundtracks are long forgotten, for example Judgment Night, but the soundtracks live on. In a lot of cases, fans took such interest in these albums because they included tracks that couldn't be found anywhere else. Before the advent of streaming, you had to actually go out and buy an album or CD, even if it only had one song by a band that you really liked. Stay tuned for 4 awesome soundtracks, some of which you may be familiar with, some of which you may not. Trust me when I say all of them are killer. The first entry on our list is the soundtrack from The Crow, a 1994 movie starring Brandon Lee. The Crow is the most critically acclaimed movie on this list, and it did well at the box office, grossing $93 million in ticket sales on a production budget of $23 million. Unfortunately, the thing that The Crow is most remembered for is the tragic death of star Brandon Lee in an on-set accident during filming. Because of the box office draw of the first movie, there were multiple sequels, but none approached the success of the original with Lee. The Crow soundtrack featured many bands at the peak of both their popularity and their creative output. Pantera makes an appearance with a cover of the Poison Idea song, The Badge. To give you an idea of where Pantera was at in their career when they recorded this, the Crow soundtrack was released exactly 1 week after Far Beyond Driven. The Badge was actually a bonus track on the Japanese version of Far Beyond Driven, but ended up on this soundtrack in America. It's a more straightforward song than those written by Pantera for Far Beyond Driven, but it's still super heavy and definitely worth a listen. Rage Against the Machine makes an appearance with a song called Darkness, on which the highlight, for me anyways, is Tom Morello's guitar solo. The subdued nature of the backing drums and bass, along with his clean guitar tone, provide a good foundation for Morello to demonstrate his skills. Other notable bands on this album include Helmet, the Rollins Band, and the Stone Temple Pilots. But the highlight of the album, in my opinion, is Nine Inch Nails' cover of the Joy Division song Dead Souls. I'm a huge Nine Inch Nails fan, and this is one of my favorite songs they've ever recorded. There's a less industrial and more organic sound to this song than most by Nine Inch Nails. If you've never heard this song, I encourage you to check it out and maybe even go on YouTube and watch the live version from Woodstock 94, which is amazing. The next soundtrack on our list is from the 1995 movie Tales from the Crypt, Demon Knight. Demon Knight was a comedy horror film based on the HBO series Tales from the Crypt. This movie was regarded by most as terrible, and the less said about it, the better. The soundtrack, however, was amazing. It opens with an edited version of Cemetery Gates by Pantera. Despite being just over a minute shorter than the version on Cowboys from Hell, it's still Cemetery Gates and it's still excellent. The Megadeth song Diadems, which later was included on the band's Hidden Treasures collection, makes its first appearance on this album. Diadems was recorded by what many, including myself, consider Megadeth's best lineup: Dave Mustaine, Dave Ellefson, Marty Friedman, and Nick Menza. It's interesting that Dave chose to include this song on a movie soundtrack and a collection of rarities. I think it would have fit nicely on Euthanasia, which was released the year prior. Other cool tracks on this album include Instant Larry by the Melvins, Beaten by Biohazard, and Policia by Sepultura. My personal favorite song on the soundtrack is My Misery by Machine Head. Demon Knight was released in January of 1995, mere months after Machine Head's debut album Burn My Eyes. Even though their second album, The More Things Change, was more than 2 years away, My Misery gave fans an excellent preview of how the band's songwriting was already evolving. A slightly different version of this song later appeared on special edition Digipack versions of The More Things Change. If you're a Machine Head fan and you haven't heard My Misery, you need to check it out ASAP. Real quick before getting into the next soundtrack, if you enjoy this type of video and get something out of it, I'd like to ask that you subscribe and hit the like button. It helps the channel out and I would really appreciate it. Thanks. Soundtrack number 3 is from the 1992 movie Singles. Singles is a movie about Gen Xers living in Seattle in the early 90s during the emergence of the grunge movement, and as you would expect, the soundtrack is dominated by Seattle bands. The opening track is Alice in Chains' classic Wood, which of course also appears on their album Dirt. Pearl Jam appears with 2 songs both specifically written for this soundtrack, Breath and State of Love and Trust. These songs fit perfectly with other Pearl Jam songs of the era, falling chronologically between the releases of 10 and Versus. If you're a Pearl Jam fan, it's likely you're quite familiar with these 2 songs. Other Seattle bands contributing to the album include Mudhoney, Mother Love Bone, The Screaming Trees, and Soundgarden. And if you're a fan of Led Zeppelin, there's a cool version of Battle of Evermore by Ann and Nancy Wilson of Heart that you should check out. Being a fan of most of the Seattle bands and grunge in general, I enjoy most of the songs on the singles soundtrack. The standout for me is the Chris Cornell song Seasons. This song is primarily just Chris singing with an acoustic guitar and is a reminder of how talented of a musician and songwriter he was. Singles, both the movie and the soundtrack, have been credited with being large contributors to the eventual explosion of the Seattle music scene in the early 90s. If you're a fan of these bands and haven't heard this soundtrack for some reason, you know what to do. The final, and possibly best, soundtrack in our list is from the 1993 movie Last Action Hero. Last Action Hero is an action comedy starring Arnold Schwarzenegger and was both a financial and critical bomb. Despite the poor reception the film got, the soundtrack is amazing. The opening track is Big Gun by AC/DC, which was a big success for the band, getting a lot of airplay on rock radio and on MTV with a video featuring Schwarzenegger. I actually really don't like this song, especially when compared to some of AC/DC's classics. The second song on the album is What the Hell Have I, one of two new tracks written by Alice in Chains for the soundtrack, with the other being A Little Bitter. Both of these songs are amazing, and if you're any sort of Alice in Chains fan, you will love them. What the Hell Have I was originally intended to be on the Dirt album, but didn't make the cut and ended up here. Making another 90s soundtrack appearance is Megadeth, this time with Angry Again, a song which was written specifically for this album and ended up being nominated for a Grammy in 1993. Angry Again is classic early 90s Megadeth and could have easily fit on either Countdown to Extinction or Euthanasia. I cannot recommend this song highly enough. Another of my favorite songs on the Last Action Hero soundtrack is Poison My Eyes by Anthrax. With this being a 90s Anthrax song, it of course features John Bush on vocals, and if you've watched my video where I ranked the Bush-era Anthrax albums, you know how I feel about that. This song leans more towards the sound of white noise than the latter Bush albums, which to me is a plus. Some of the other bands included on this album are Queensryche, Def Leppard, and Cypress Hill. The title track by Tesla, a band that I secretly love, is really cool and an excellent inclusion on the soundtrack. Despite the fact that the movie was panned and lost a ton of money at the box office, the Last Action Hero soundtrack is a great collection of songs and my favorite movie soundtrack from this era. It's possible that you're aware of some of these songs without realizing where they originally came from. If that's the case, you should give this album a listen. Thanks everyone for watching. If I missed any songs on these soundtracks that you like, or missed any other soundtracks that you think should have been here, let me know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you're a fan of the music I talked about today and would like to see additional videos in the future. I'll see you next time.